The slaves called it a big house. Though not many lived in these houses, these luxuries were enjoyed by some slave owners. To these southern slave owners, this was their comfortable residence and the representation of their wealth. To the slaves, though, the place is full of horrible memories. Just beside the big house were usually the slaves' residences. Usually consisting of filthy cabins, slaves were forced to sleep in these cabins, sharing the space with others. The cabins were not only too dark and drafty for the slaves, but sometimes even had leaky roofs. Such were the horrifying circumstances that slaves had to deal with, unlike their owners. We enter some Negroes' huts, for their habitations cannot be called houses. They are far more miserable than the poorest of the cottages of our peasants. The usual diet of the slaves consisted of some bacon, cornbread, and sweet potatoes roasted in ashes. The slaves were only given 2 meals. Though food portions were insufficient for the slaves that worked in the fields, the distribution of the foods took place only in midweek. Slaves usually wore a piece of cloth or carpet when working. The clothes distributed to the slaves were stuffy, but were made to last long. The slaves disliked these clothes under hot sun, and some wore nothing at all during the summer. Some slaves were owned by kind slave owners. Many were not as lucky. For the majority of the slaves, punishments were practiced on them as a warning to the entire group. The slaves were often harshly treated by their owners for the slightest mistakes. Punishments ranged from lashes to horrifying tortures invented by their owners. The constitutional rights were not bestowed to the slaves. The South, which sanctioned these punishments, made the beatings of slavery considered legal.
My master used to throw me a bucket and whip me. He'd put my hands together and tie them. He'd whip me on one side till that was sore and full of blood. Then he'd whip me on the other side till that was all tore up.
Former slave Alla Wilson was not alone. Like herself, many slaves had to suffer physical pain and constitutional injustice during their lives as slaves. Owners punished them physically, but also trained them mentally as loyal servants of himself. While ordering them to be nice to their owners and servants, they attempted to show that blacks were inferior to whites. They also made it seem like slavery was a stage to become the owner of the plantation. Some slaves were convinced by their owners and believed that their best interest was to serve their master. They did whatever it required to please their master, and even events when a treacherous house slave betraying others took place. These were exactly what the owner wanted slaves to be. Slaves were not only restricted in rights but also behavior. Slaves were banned from assemblies, roaming around freely, and received no form of education. What's worse, many freed blacks went back into slavery when the Fugitive Slave Act came into effect. Slaves were deprived of their citizenship and were considered as property rather than people. They were given harsh treatments. As Lincoln once lamented, all men are created equal except for Negroes. Slavery was essential for labor forces in the South and provided cheap labor. Thus, the victims of slavery were looked down as property, physically harassed by working in lashes, and what's worse, they were deprived from the citizenship and all constitutional rights the land of liberty promised. Slavery exists to this day. Believe it or not, people are working at this very moment while earning no profit at all. Setting aside the changed form of slavery, which results mainly to collect debts and illegal labor, the torments the slaves in the 1800s faced, and slaves today are facing, are alike.